Rob, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, great to be here.
Thank you for talking to us about this book ban in Alberta. We really wanted to have someone on who understands what has been going on inside of the province, especially over the past few weeks. So let's talk a little bit about this book ban. How did it start and evolve to the point where we are today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the past few weeks. I mean, you can go back the past few months, even you could go back the past few years. So there's a few different things at play. One of them is really specifically around books, and certain books in particular. There were a few graphic novels in Alberta that were kind of the center of this. And if you look around in other jurisdictions, particularly in the US, these exact same books have been a source of controversy. So that's part of it. There's a broader issue here, too, I think, of what's going on in schools, and are parents aware of what's going on in schools or aware what their kids might be exposed to. You know, Alberta, like a few other provinces, have gone through this whole debate around like the use of names or pronouns. Like if kids want to use a different pronoun or a different name, should parents be notified? So there's that as kind of a broader context. So basically the short version is back in the spring, it was brought to the government's attention that a few of these controversial graphic novels had been found in certain Alberta school libraries. So the Alberta government sort of took that as a jumping off point to saying, hey, maybe we need a much broader policy here regarding content in school libraries. And if there's stuff in there that kids shouldn't be seeing or isn't age appropriate, that needs to be dealt with. So they took a few months to come up with this, I guess what we call it a ministerial order. So the education minister puts out the edict in July to school boards. Okay, here's how it's going to be. Here's the new criteria. You got to get all this material out of schools that we consider to be explicit sexual content. Problem was the way that was written in the order was easily applicable to all kinds of different books. Like it didn't even specify images, like words, images, audio, video, were all considered the same. So the Edmonton Public School Board did their assessment, and they came up with a list of about 200 books that they felt needed to be pulled in order to comply with this order. We learned about that last week, and it just set off this whole firestorm that, well, hang on a second here. Why are schools banning The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, or even the book Atlas Shrugged, which Danielle Smith herself has identified as a personal favorite. So it really prompted this whole debate around, well, what is explicit sexual content? What should be in schools? And did the Alberta government screw this up? Was this the Edmonton Public School Board kind of thumbing their nose at government policy? So that's kind of how we got here.
I think what it has been really interesting about this story, especially over the past few days, is that there's a bit of a blame game going on. So I think what we've seen is that when it comes to the school board in Edmonton, they were really just trying to do their best based on the fact that the order, like you have said, didn't have a lot of details in it. And also the school board only had a few more weeks to comply to this order. When Margaret Atwood got involved, I would argue that has been kind of a tipping point insofar as the media paying attention to the situation. Can you talk a little bit about what took place then?
Yeah, I mean, Margaret Atwood speaking out about this, you had international coverage. I mean, the BBC was covering this, other American media outlets. So sort of that international spotlight. And I think even too, just the idea, I mean, Danielle Smith holds herself up as kind of a libertarian. So the idea that this libertarian premier is implementing maybe the most sweeping book ban we've ever seen in Alberta or even in this country. I think they bristled at that criticism. So part of it then was lashing out at the Edmonton Public School Board. And again, I don't think the board did anything wrong here. I don't think anyone who has criticized the school board has been able to go back and say, well, this book shouldn't have been pulled or that book shouldn't have been pulled, because again, is under the definition of what is explicit sexual content. There are passages in all of these books that meet that definition. So the problem for the Alberta or the Edmonton Public School Board is, well, down the road, if they say, well, we'll just leave that book there, they probably didn't mean that book, then maybe you get criticized down the road. Well, that book shouldn't be on the shelf. Why is it? So they were going to get criticized either way. And I think the Alberta government realized that maybe they screwed this up without admitting it. They said, okay, we're going to pause this. We're going to clarify the criteria, the definition, and we're still waiting to see that. But, the premier has emphasized a few times in her comments, we want it to be about graphic images. And like I say, this initial order didn't distinguish between words and images.
Let's talk a little bit more about the order. I was reading a story that you had written about this, an opinion piece in the Calgary Herald. And from what I do understand, when we look at this order, one of the things that really surprised me is that it wasn't specific to certain grades. Is that correct?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, there were different categories. So the category that was referred to as explicit sexual content, that needed to be gone, period, from all schools, all grades, could not be in any schools at all. There was a separate category that was referred to as non-explicit sexual content. And this would be the sort of stuff that maybe could be there in high schools, but probably shouldn't be there in junior high or middle school or elementary schools. But the problem, again, with the explicit sexual content definition is just how sweeping it was. So we get all of these books that maybe should be like in high schools, like The Handmaid's Tale as an example, that met that criteria and had to be pulled all together. So I think the Alberta government initially was trying to draw that distinction, but just kind of the clumsy way they went about it led to this whole situation here.
What do you think about the Premier's reaction? I saw even as recently as today some posts online where she had said, if the Edmonton Public School Board needs us to go through the books one by one, we can help them do that. Is this really the government's role to do something like that?
Well, I mean, it could be. That's the whole thing. If the Alberta government wants to be the ones to come up with a list and hand it to school board and say, here, these are the books that need to go, they could do that, but they chose not to. Instead, again, they came up with, here's the definition. So go through your libraries. Again, I mean, look, these are thousands of books in school libraries or even materials that are just in classrooms. Go through all of it. Here's the definition. Go through your materials and your books. And if any of those meet that definition, then they got to go. So that's what the Alberta government did here. Again, I'm not sure the idea that the Edmonton Public School Board should have said, okay, this book meets that definition, but they probably don't want it banned. We'll just leave it there. And I'm sure the education minister didn't want 100 different phone calls. Well, what about this book? What about that book? Again, it's all spelled out in the definition. I don't want to get into all the details, but it is spelled out as to what constitutes explicit sexual content. And, you know, in the piece that I wrote, I used the example of Atlas Shrugged because of the fact that Danielle Smith has said that it's a favorite of hers. In fact, she even said the other day, maybe it should be mandatory reading in high schools. Like it can't be both ways. There are passages in Atlas Shrugged that are, you know, sexual in nature, and the way it's described, these encounters in the book between the main character and some of her lovers, that it would meet this definition. So the idea that it's explicit and it should be banned, but it's also valuable and should be mandatory reading, like it can't be both, right? So yeah, the Premier's been on the defensive, but I think ultimately that's partly because governments don't like to acknowledge that they screwed up. And I think in this case, the Alberta government screwed up.
I think one of the things that really interests me is because we are first and foremost a technology show. And so we report a lot on how children use technology, especially when it comes to some of the big tech companies that exist out there. Just recently, we did a segment on ChatGPT in the case where there's a family who is suing OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, because their 16-year-old son committed suicide. ChatGPT in many ways acted almost like a mentor through this process, which went on for weeks and weeks. I mean, just devastating to read that. I've been reporting on online safety for kids for many, many years. And so one of the things that really strikes me as sort of bizarre about this story is that in this age of digital access, where most kids are handed a smartphone when they're still in elementary school, and we live in a country where there aren't any specific rules in terms of keeping kids safe from online harms, it seems so unusual to me that we have gone to banning individual books. I mean, we're lucky if kids even read.
Well, yeah, no kidding. And it was funny because as I was kind of debating this on Twitter and elsewhere, you know, someone said to me, like, you know, hang on a second here. There's a reason why Penthouse magazine is way on the back shelf. And I kind of laughed, like, you think young people today even know what that is, or the idea of a magazine? That seems so bizarre. And it shows how outdated maybe a lot of us are approaching this, you know, the way we're thinking about this. Because, yeah, you're right. Kids are walking around with these phones where they have almost instantaneous access, if they want it, to what we would refer to as pornography. And even now with what's going on with AI and certain versions of AI and what AI can create, it's just, yeah, it's really troubling, the potential here. And so if we're worried about what kids are having access to, it seems weird that we're parsing paragraphs in a Margaret Atwood book versus what are kids accessing on their phones? How much access do they have to stuff that they should definitely not be seeing? That seems like a much bigger issue, a much bigger challenge for us right now.
In some ways, it seems like an easier battle, right? It's much easier to ban a few books than it is to deal with this issue of online harms and kids on the internet. You've been covering politics for a really long time. When you think about perhaps the battle that should be had as far as online safety and kids, I mean, are we fooling ourselves by just getting distracted by all of these other mechanisms, whether it's talking about pronouns or talking about banning books, when the real issue, and we see this in all of the data when it comes to issues with anxiety and depression, we see that the internet is first and foremost to blame for many of those issues.
Yeah. And I mean, sure, there's politics to play here, right? I mean, there's these groups that want these books banned. And I think it's helpful for, conservative governments like we have in Alberta to not anger those groups and keep them on side. And there's other issues that come into play about, the perception that teachers are left wing or they're trying to put ideas in your kid's head that you don't want. And so all of that comes into play in these debates. But it is a bit of a distraction, I think you're right, from the whole question of the well-being of young people and what kids are being exposed to, not just in terms of accessing adult content, but the way in which they're interacting with each other, the sorts of bullying that take place, the way in which social media algorithms are manipulating them and how they think about themselves and how they interact with the world, the idea of just going out and hanging out with friends. And, it's kind of turned childhood on its head in a lot of ways. And so you're right. I think if we're focused on books in a library, we're kind of missing the boat. I think the kids probably aren't going to libraries in the first place. We could get them there. I think that would be a positive, and then we could worry about the books after that. But no, you're right. I think they're on their devices. They're not spending a lot of time scouring the shelves of the school library hoping to find something racy.
Yeah, when I was reading all of these different posts and watching all of the news stories on this issue, I thought to myself for a second, this could have been something that happened maybe in 1990, right? Like if you were just to pull this out and plant it directly in 1990 and say the Premier of Alberta and her government are banning books, they're pulling books from shelves. Margaret Atwood is complaining about what's taking place because one of her classics is being banned. And I thought, what do we do in our society today when we have 2025 problems in front of us, but we're still arguing for issues that are decades old?
Yeah, and I remember that. I think, in high school, we read Catcher in the Rye. And at the time, I remember maybe that shouldn't be for kids. That's maybe too racy or adult in some ways. And so it feels like we've been debating this for, generations almost, but we're at a point now where, as you say, technology has changed, the whole conversation dramatically about, how kids are growing up, what they're being exposed to, as we say, how they're interacting with one another and the kinds of pressures they're facing. So I think a conversation about the well-being of children that's happening in 2025 needs to be a conversation that reflects all the realities of being a kid in 2025.
You're a podcaster. You also work for a mainstream media outlet. So certainly you've seen many of the culture wars that are unfolding on the internet. And when this story broke, especially over the past week, I think one of the things that I really started to notice was how people were weaponizing this news for whatever side that they might be on. I mean, I saw this all over Instagram. People were standing and holding copies of the books that had been banned to try to gain support. And, you see it again with the Alberta government as well. And so the story that unfolds online also, I think, impacts what ends up happening in the real world.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of, delicate issues that are maybe a little more current today. Like, when I was in school, no one really talked about sexuality or gender, like sexual orientation or gender identity, or the idea that there would be gay straight alliances in school. Like none of that existed. So a lot of this is more modern. And I think to parents today, it's kind of unknown and it's kind of scary. And so once you get into this whole debate around, okay, are things happening at school that are being kept secret from me as a parent or that I don't know about or I don't fully understand, parents can get nervous and apprehensive. And so I do think, governments see an opportunity at times to say, okay, well, parents are nervous. We'll be the champions of these parents. We're going to say, hey, we're on your side in this. And that can be politically powerful. And so I think that affects a lot of these debates. These are politicians that are elected to govern. So they're inherently going to be political in a lot of ways in how they operate. They want to win elections and keep getting reelected. So it's impossible probably to separate the politics from it all. but it does complicate things. And these are tricky issues. Like, what do you do in schools where you've got kids that are unsure about their sexuality or their gender, and maybe they want to experiment, or maybe they're going in a certain direction and they're more comfortable being called a different name. Like, how do schools manage all of that? There are no easy answers here, but these issues do get politicized, and then accusations start flying, like, the government's trying to out kids, and the government doesn't care about gay or transgendered kids, or teachers are indoctrinating kids and they don't care about parents or parental rights. Like, it can get pretty heated.
And it does kind of feel, and again, if I go back to the fact that you have covered politics for a really long time, it does feel like in some ways we're importing some of these political conversations that are having been had in the US, right? Yep. I see that in the US all the time. I mean, we see the book bans, and of course that is replicated here in Canada. We see these same sort of culture wars that are coming into our country. But in some ways, and I mean, if we zoom out from Alberta, it does appear to me that we're just a different country entirely.
Well, we are. And I mean, there are some similarities. It is interesting, as I alluded to at the outset, like one of these graphic novels that was at the source of the controversy in Alberta, it's called Genderqueer. And it's a memoir, but it's a graphic novel. And you can look in certain U.S. states where this book was at the flashpoint of some huge controversies. And in particular, in the state of Virginia, in 2021, it kind of swung the governor's race to the Republicans because it became such a flashpoint. So I do think you had groups in Canada saying, okay, well, this played out in our favor in the U.S. Maybe, if we look around and we snoop around, and maybe there's some libraries in Canada where you can find this book, and maybe we can turn it into an issue here and try to galvanize people in a similar way. So, yeah, I think some of that is importing U.S. politics and U.S. strategies. But again, this whole question of, what is in my kid's school's library? What might they be exposed to? What is appropriate for an 8-year-old versus a 17-year-old? Like, I think there are realistic and relative and reasonable conversations that can be had along those lines. But when people are doing it to advance a culture war and, to drive political wedges, I don't think that's helpful. And I don't think ultimately that benefits kids.
I think also when we talk about kids, I think one of the things I see more and more, and again, I don't want to call out any specific politician, but I do think that kids kind of get caught in the crosshairs a lot these days when it comes to some of these culture wars that are taking place, right? And they already have enough to worry about. The last thing they really need is to be brought into all of these daily feuds that adults are having online. And yet, and again, if I kind of zoom out from the fact that we have bigger issues that we need to be talking about, whether it's climate or big tech or our energy transition, whatever it might be, time and time again, kids are getting drawn into these conversations and not really having a voice at the table in the process.
Yeah, it's true. And I think ultimately it stems from a good place. Like, I think we all want what's best for our kids, and that's a good impulse to have. But it's powerful too, politically powerful. There's an old classic joke from The Simpsons, right, where one of the characters says, "Won't somebody please think of the children?" And how can you object to that? Well, one side says we're on the side of kids, we're in favor of kids. Well, there's no rebuttal to that. It's like a way of shutting down arguments almost because, everyone wants what's best for kids. So that's a good impulse to have. And I think at times that can lead to productive conversations. In Alberta, and as with other provinces, there's been a real robust conversation around maybe we shouldn't allow cell phones in class. Now, that doesn't change the access that kids have outside of class. But if it's a distraction in school, maybe it makes sense that they leave the cell phone at home or in the locker, or they check it somehow at the start of the day. I think that's been less political because it doesn't have those same kind of culture war issues. And again, I think that's a case where the impulse is what's best for kids, and maybe that can lead to a smarter regulation of something or better policy of something. So I think that can sometimes take us to good places. At times, I think it takes us to issues that become too political and aren't really, I think, in the best interest of kids at the end of the day. And I think this whole controversy in Alberta is maybe an example of that, and perhaps a lesson for other jurisdictions to learn from.
It's interesting you bring up cell phones in schools, because I do think that is one of those policies. And we've seen it over the past couple of years where more and more provinces are really locking down on this idea where phones need to be kept away during the school day or not brought to school altogether. And I think you're right. You have unanimous support for those types of policies. Yeah. Those types of policies make sense. I would also argue we would see the same thing in terms of online harms and trying to regulate some of the social media giants that are in our country today. Getting back to the book ban specifically, do you think this is even going to be on our radar in a few weeks? Like, did it make a blip in terms of a conversation that we're going to continue to have?
Well, I don't know. It remains to be seen. I do think partly here in Alberta, we got a whole situation where teachers are on the verge of either going on strike or being locked out. And if that happens, well, that's all anyone's going to be thinking about and talking about if schools are shut down because of a labor dispute. So that would push the whole book ban to the back burner. I do wonder, though, if other provinces are kind of watching all of this. Originally it started with one province, the whole issue of gender pronouns and names, and then other provinces picked up on that. So I do wonder if maybe other provincial governments were kind of watching what was happening in Alberta to see what Alberta did and what the reaction was. So I do wonder, because Alberta's government was so stung by the pushback, maybe other provinces are like, we don't want to touch that. And maybe that's all that happens here. But yeah, ultimately, I think that'll be the test as to whether this is a lasting issue, whether other provinces take up the mantle and say, yeah, we need to clean up our school libraries. We need to get the filth out of libraries, or can cut another way. I mean, there was a controversy in Ontario a couple of years ago where they were removing what they consider to be outdated books from libraries, and maybe more that impulse from the left, like these books are a little insensitive when it comes to race, and we don't want kids exposed to that sort of thing. And it's coming from a different side of the political spectrum, but it's kind of the same, right? Like we got to protect the kids from this bad stuff. So it's come up before, maybe it'll come up again. I guess we'll see how other provinces choose to deal with this.
Do you have a lot of librarians in schools in Alberta? Because that is one role that I've seen here in Ontario that increasingly, when we have budget cuts, those people tend to get cut first.
Yeah, and that's been an issue here too. I think they've certainly been challenged on that side, but it is still a position that exists. And it's funny because in this whole debate, it's almost like they're forgotten. Like we just sort of think, okay, there's that room full of books and kids just wander in and take what they want. Like you do have schools in Alberta, as you do elsewhere, that are like kindergarten through grade 9 or kindergarten through grade 12. And when you've got a situation where you've got a school with 6-year-olds and 16-year-olds, you've got to be diligent in how all of these resources are managed. And that's kind of what school librarians are trained to do. So we do sort of forget that they're there, they exist. It's not this kind of free-for-all maybe that people are imagining when it comes to access to certain kinds of content. So it is important, I think, to have those experts that make these decisions, that are reviewing materials, that understand what's age appropriate and how to guide kids. And so they, it's funny because they play an important role, but I think they've been kind of forgotten in this whole conversation.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think at some point, too, we have to trust those people to help to make those decisions. I mean, they're going to know best. And like we've said a number of times, I think many of us would be really excited if we knew kids wanted to flock to the library and read books in the first place. And yes, I think once they get there, maybe we can have that conversation about what's allowed and what's not allowed. And I think use common sense throughout that whole process. I mean, this isn't really a difficult thing, I think, to be able to achieve, especially with those people like librarians who are part of that conversation. Before I let you go, I had mentioned that you are a podcaster. You also write a column. Tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, we got the Rob Breakenridge Show, which I do. You can find that at robbreakenridge.ca. I also work with The Line and the new podcast, The Line Alberta. So alberta.readtheline.ca, an Alberta-focused podcast. Comes out every Wednesday. I also write for the Calgary Herald as well, calgaryherald.com. So busy guy, I guess, which is good. Yeah.
Is there anything that those of us in Ontario should know about what's happening in Alberta that maybe we get wrong sometimes?
Well, it seems to be a lot happening in Alberta these days. I think, Alberta is unique in some respects in terms of much of the political debate. I think people probably noticed that there's a lot of focus right now on Alberta's place in Confederation, our relationship with Ottawa. And, just sort of how folks are feeling in the aftermath of a federal election where Alberta voted one way, the rest of the country voted another way. So, that's kind of unique to Alberta, and that's probably a bigger issue than books in libraries. So, but I think, again, some of these issues around books in schools and the relationship between teachers and kids and teachers and parents, those are not specific at all, or not unique to Alberta at all. And so I think that's relevant here, but I would imagine that's relevant right across the country.
Yeah, and we should also say that, book bans have been around since the beginning of time, right? This is, again, something that is not new. I think nobody really wants to see it. We want people to read as much as possible, but this certainly is a conversation that has pretty deep roots as well. So I'm sure we'll hear more about this. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today on the show.
Yeah, that was fun. Thanks for having me.